Okay. Professor Norman, thank you very much for joining me today. Pleasure to have you.
I'll decide on that question when the interview is over.
Okay, so just to introduce us to this conversation, in May 2024, the prosecutor of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, submitted applications for arrest warrants against Netanyahu, Gallant, the late chairman of the Hamas political bureau, Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, and the commander of Al-Qassam brigades, Hamad Deif. Karim Khan, since was subject to legal investigations regarding possible, sexual harassment of some sort. Recently, 5 months later, those arrest warrants were issued. Just going back to the history of the ICC as well, in December 2019, the ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda also issued a statement on the situation in Palestine, saying that war crimes have been or are being committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. In a recent article in The Guardian, Fatou Bensouda said she and her family were subject to direct threats while working on the most sensitive cases. Although Bensouda did not make this link, the Guardian investigation revealed how an Israeli spy chief allegedly threatened her in an attempt to prevent an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territories committed by the State of Israel. So just going back to Karim Khan's recent proceedings, I can't help but I'm going to throw a few questions here, and I'll leave you to expand on them. Like, why did it take 5 months to issue those arrest warrants? There's a genocide unfolding and intensifying by the day in front of our eyes. Couldn't Karim Khan see that? And, talk about the legal harassment that, the Guardian article brings about, that the ICC prosecutors faced when issuing legal proceedings regarding Israeli criminal conduct in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Was there precedence in history of such harassment against ICC prosecutors in other cases, for example? And while you speak about this, I know you've invested a lot of your time talking about Operation Cast Lead and what happened afterwards. If you could expand on also the Goldstone report issued in 2009 by the UN fact-finding mission into the war in Gaza, if you can call it a war, following Operation Cast Lead, whereby 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza were murdered, including more than 300 children in 11 days. So there's a lot there. So if you could just elaborate on some of these details for us.
It's really not going to be possible because of constraints of time. I'll try to discuss two questions which we can separate out. Let's start with the ICC. The ICC is a joke. Well, let's just get clear with the nomenclature for the audience. There is the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and that is the legal arm of the United Nations, and it's considered the authoritative legal body in the world. That's the ICJ, the legal arm of the United Nations. And then we have the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The ICJ goes back a long way, the International Court of Justice. It was a continuation of I forgot the name now, but the League of Nations had a legal body also. And the International Court of Justice was a continuation after World War II, when the United Nations was created, of the legal body of the League of Nations. So it has a long history. And you could say, at least in its present incarnation, I would say it's a respectable body. Jurists of real stature have been appointed to it. There used to be automatically the 5 members of the Security Council had automatic representation on it. This past 2 years, for the first time, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russian representative was not appointed on the ICJ. It has 15 members. The ICC is a very recent contrivance. It's established okay, it just slipped my mind. It was established in, can you just check that? When was that? It just slipped my mind. I was just going to say the year and then my brain went blank. When was the ICC founded? I think 1998. 1998.
2002.
2002. I was close. I think some people dated from 1998, but others may date from 2000.
I would have thought it was earlier than that. Interesting.
No. It's a very recent body, the ICC, and it's chief. Well, the lead officer in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is called the chief prosecutor, and its chief prosecutors have been real lowlives. There was Luis something Ocampo, I can't remember his middle name. Luis, he was, I think, from Colombia, if my memory is right. He was followed by Fatou Bensouda, and then Fatou Bensouda was followed by Karim Khan. So it's only had 3 chief prosecutors in its whole history. And it only prosecuted African leaders. It became such a running joke that it came to be called ICC, International Caucasian Court, because it only prosecuted African leaders. And then they tried to, they started to play the game of identity politics, and they chose an African woman to be the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. And she continued, but now she pretended as if she was only prosecuting African leaders because as an African, she was concerned about African leaders. And one of the cases that came before her was the case of the Mavi Marmara. Now, most of your listeners will not even know about that case. So what happens is, in 2010, a humanitarian flotilla goes to Gaza to bring its supplies. This is after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9.
And to break the siege, basically.
Yeah, to break the siege of Gaza. And on May 31st, 2010, Israeli commandos attacked the flotilla. The flagship was the Mavi Marmara, attacked it and killed 10 passengers aboard the Mavi Marmara. Now, the boat was owned by the state of the Comoros, Comoros. And the Comoros brought a case against Israel to the ICC when Fatou Bensouda was the chief prosecutor. And then began what I think is properly characterized as a civil war within the ICC, because Fatou Bensouda was doing everything in her power to kill the case. So she kept saying, case closed, case closed. And then units within the ICC protested, and the case was appealed. The appeal was held up once. The appeal was held up twice. The appeal was held up 3 times, because what Fatou Bensouda was doing in terms of denaturing and falsifying the documentary record was so outrageous, so off the wall, that the appeals in what's called the PTC, pre-trial chamber, the appeals were held up by the PTC. And to tell you the truth, I don't even know how the case ever ended, because the appeals kept coming, and I assume it just died at a certain point, the whole case. I wrote an entire book on the subject. It was just on this case. It's called I Accuse Herewith a Proof Beyond Reasonable Doubt that ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda whitewashed Israel. That's the subtitle. So now, there were always, or I should say, beginning in 2015, a second case was opened in the ICC. The first case, as I said, was brought by the Comoros because they owned the Mavi Marmara. It was the property of the Comoros. The second case was brought by this newly born entity called the State of Palestine. And the United Nations General Assembly granted the state of Palestine representation at the UN and acknowledged that it was a state. Why do I mention that? Because the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is a state-based institution. That is to say, only states can bring complaints to the ICC. And so Palestine had to establish a legal claim to be a state. It established that claim in 2015, and immediately as it established its claim, it then brought a complaint to the ICC that Israel was in breach of international law. And the two main items in its complaint were, number one, the settlements that Israel was building in the West Bank, which under the Rome Statute of the ICC, those settlements constitute war crimes. And number two, it brought before the ICC the complaint on the basis of the crimes that Israel committed in Gaza during Operation Protective Edge, July through August 2014, because they were allowed to retroactively make a complaint for a year. So they got their claim to state, they were acknowledged to be a state, or the fancy word is their accession, ACCESSION, their accession to the ICC was in 2015, and then their complaint was retroactive 1 year to Operation Protective Edge. And now, here's the bottom line. As you can guess, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. This complaint has been lingering for 10 years in the ICC. Nothing was done about it. It was going, I have a whole shelf here of just all the litigation about this complaint because the question kept coming up whether the ICC had the jurisdiction, which meant whether the ICC was correct in stating that Palestine was a state. There was all this debate about what is a state, and did Palestine constitute a state under international law, or did Palestine constitute a state according to the statutes of the ICC? And this went on and on and on and on. It never ended. I gave up. I stopped writing about it because it just seemed totally pointless. And then after October 7th, Karim Khan finally acted on the basis of not the original complaints, the settlements and the Operation Protective Edge. He acted on the basis of the crimes that Israel was committing after October 7th in Gaza. Well, the only reason he acted is because the pressure, the ICC was becoming a laughing joke.
When it comes to Palestine.
Yeah, well, if you don't act in Palestine, then what are you doing? The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the legal arm of the United Nations, had already ruled that Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. Why aren't you doing anything? So he had to finally act, or the whole institution would have been completely discredited. But he's a complete sack of shit. I mean, he is such a slime ball. He gives slime balls a bad name. You know, if you look at his indictment, and I just don't have the time, but if you look at his arrest warrants, okay? He charges Israel with war crimes, the crime against humanity of extermination, and sundry other things. Because he's such a cowardly sack of shit, he charges Hamas with the identical crimes as Israel, as if there's any comparison in order of magnitude. But then he throws in the sexual violence.
Exactly. I wanted to ask you this question. I mean, I've got this sentence in it's very irritating. I want to read it if I may, Norman. It says, "My office submits there are reasonable grounds to believe that hostages taken from Israel have been kept in inhumane conditions, and that some have been subject to sexual violence, including rape, while being held in captivity." So this is just a small statement there. I mean, what evidence does he have at this stage?
Well, there are a number of things to say. Number one, a comparable claim was not made against Israel, although the evidence is overwhelming, not least as a result of Israeli videos that were posted on the web, that Israel is engaged in massive sexual violence, including rape, against Palestinian detainees. There's not even a dispute about that anymore. In fact, senior officials in Israel said that it was okay to rape Palestinians being detained in Israel. They approved of it. So, why wasn't that included in the indictment against Israel, the sexual violence? Number two, the claim against Hamas of sexual violence on October 7th. There's no evidence of it. I have gone through the record very carefully. I have investigated it. If it were true, it's true. Horrendous things happened on October 7th. There's no question about that. There was crimes of a very high magnitude. You cannot dismiss 815 civilian deaths. It's not possible. You can make all sorts of mitigating arguments. Well, Israelis killed some of them, in the crossfire, and all sorts of attempts. It wasn't Hamas. It was riffraff and ruffians from Gaza. You can try all these attempts to minimize what happened October 7th, but the bottom line is crimes of a significant magnitude occurred. You can't get around that, and you shouldn't try to get around it. You have to deal with the facts as they are, not pretend that they are as you wish them to be. That having been said, there are clearly claims that were made by Israel for which there's no factual basis. The beheading of the babies, zero factual basis. The claim of rape on October 7th, no factual basis. It's a very striking fact when you go through the record, and I've gone through the record. If you take the case of the Pramila Patten investigative mission to Gaza, Pramila Patten was appointed by Secretary General Gutierrez to investigate the claim of sexual violence. Now, she concludes that there was rape and there was mass rape and blah, 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 blah. But then there was the question of the evidence. What's your evidence? She acknowledges there is no forensic evidence of rape. She acknowledges there's no digital evidence of rape. She said that we looked at 50 hours of digital evidence. That included CCTV, it included dash cam, it included the body cams of militants, and it included the iPhone digital photographic evidence. She said we looked at 50 hours of digital evidence, which is no small amount. It's no small amount. It's 2 hours of digital evidence for every hour of October 7th. That's not a small amount. And she said we looked at 5,000 photographs. 5,000 photographs. And she said there is no digital or photographic evidence of sexual violence. That's what she said. So it does make you wonder how it came to pass that according to Pramila Patten and the State of Israel, at places like the Nova Music Festival, where the largest number of civilian killings occurred, at places like the Nova Music Festival, they said there was gang rape at the parking area. There was gang rape in an open field. How could there be no digital evidence? How could there be no
Apaches and the drones were flying ahead.
Well, they didn't mention that evidence. They referred to CCTV, dash cam, body cam, and iPhone. Because at that point, there were no Apaches. Remember, it's at the very beginning. It's October 7th, and Israel took a long time to respond. But it is odd that they say there are 37, between 15 and 37 eyewitnesses. That's what they say. 15 and 37 eyewitnesses. Not one thought to take out his or her iPhone and document it. If you look at, for example, the report that came out a couple of days ago by Lee Mordechai on genocide in Gaza. Are you familiar with that report?
No, not really. No.
Yeah, it just came out. And he cites dozens of video evidence of the crimes that Israelis themselves took in Gaza. You know, the Israelis were photographing when they were blowing up buildings, when they were running over, trucks were running over Palestine. They were photographing everything, right? And according to the UN report, the Commission of Inquiry report, another article, I won't go into the names. They said these witnesses, they were hiding, okay? As they were watching these mass rapes. And you didn't take one picture? Not one picture. Nobody thought to document it. So that's, in my opinion, there's no evidence, I'll just say it. The UN Commission of Inquiry and what was the other commission? Oh, Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch put out a very big report on October 7th, 250 pages. Mostly garbage, in my opinion, but that's a separate issue. And both of them said they could not confirm that rape occurred on October 7th. Now, as to the hostages, I should also say Pramila Patten pointed out that not one alleged survivor came forward to talk to them, to her mission, not one. That's very strange. You know why that's strange? Because they say, oh, because the women were traumatized and they're so afraid. Well, really, that's a little odd. First of all, Israel is a very sexually libertine country. So, as you know, in our modern culture, women are not particularly shy about claiming rape. It's not the taboo it once was. Many women come forward and claim rape when rape didn't happen.
Especially in this context, like you have this huge allegations in the Western media. If it did happen, then they will feel obliged for national reasons.
Agree.
Nationalistic.
Totally agree. But there's another side. Gaza is a very sexually puritanical society. And women's virtue and purity are a high premium is attached to it. If you read, for example, the UN Commission of Inquiry report, the women were very straightforward about being sexually molested by the Israeli soldiers. They weren't afraid to speak. They weren't traumatized. So why did the women in Gaza freely speak about the sexual violence that they experienced, but suddenly the Israeli women become so fragile and so fearful that not one came forward to speak to the Patten mission? Now, as of now, one woman from October 7th stepped forward, but I can't remember the exact. Oh yeah, they said one of the reports. I've read so many, my mind is already fried. I forgot which one. They said a woman did step forward, but they couldn't confirm or deny her testimony. They had no basis for making a judgment. Now there is one woman from a released hostage that claims she was raped. All I could say is her story keeps changing, it keeps mutating. And in her last interview that she gave a speech. Among other things she said was she was glad that Israel was starving the population of Gaza. Yeah, she said that. She was glad that they were starving the population of Gaza. And what else did she say? I can't remember. Let's just say I would not classify her as a reliable witness. But the odd thing is that Karim Khan, he leveled that charge against Hamas, and he didn't level it against Israel.
Yes, and he made that statement with almost complete confidence that this actually occurred, even with the lack of evidence. So I want to talk more about the ICC because I am pretty frustrated, to say the least, that it took 5 months for him to actually, or for the ICC to act on the applications. But as you say now, I mean, things have been in this process for years and years and years when it came to Operation Protective
It's been
Edge.
10 years. And I think you see, the ICC now is just acting because of the ICJ, because of the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, and because a case is now, and because it's now being litigated in the ICJ, it'll probably take, I'm sorry to report, it'll take about 2 years, I'm told, before the ICJ makes a decision as to whether Israel is guilty of genocide. South Africa submitted a 750-page, what's called memorial, basically its case, with 4,000 pages of a supplement of the evidence, 4,000 pages of evidence. Just to get through that, it's going to take a while.
Yeah, it will take a lot of time. I mean,
but
even the
so long,
yeah.
my point was only that so long as it's a live case in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the ICC has to do something. Otherwise, it looks completely ridiculous. So I think that's the only reason. I'm sure he's coming under a lot of internal pressure, like, what the hell are you waiting for? Why aren't you doing anything? So he finally had to act.
I mean, a genocide is unfolding in front of our eyes. I mean, can we say that international law doesn't work anymore? I mean,
no,
if
I don't
that
think
statement...
I don't think that statement is correct because of the last word you used, anymore. It's never worked. It's always victor's justice, or the direct justice of the powerful. However, it's a powerful weapon for us. For us to now be able to say there are warrants for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant, the defense minister, for committing war crimes in Gaza. If we're able to say that the ICJ has said that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza, these are powerful weapons in the struggle to win over public opinion. In the court of public opinion, the fact that we can brandish these weapons, they're very valuable. But if you're expecting ultimately justice to prevail, well, that's just never going to happen. You already know the answer to that. You know how you know? You know it because South Africa went before the ICJ 4 times: January, February, March, and May. Okay? Each time it asked the court to indicate, that's the word they use, indicate provisional measures. That is to say, what we call in the United States, I don't know what you call it, Australia, we call it a restraining order, which means, let's say, you have a man who's credibly accused of battering his wife. Then the man is removed from even before the matter has been resolved in court. The man is removed from the premises and he's ordered to keep his distance from his spouse. He's not been convicted, but there's enough evidence that he's committed, that he may have committed the crime, that it warrants what we call in the US a restraining order. Okay? And the ICJ has the equivalent. It's called to indicate provisional measures. And basically what that means in the case of Gaza, the South Africa asked the court to tell Israel, one, to refrain from committing war crimes in Gaza, and two, to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. Okay? January, February, March, May, the ICJ indicates provisional measures. It does. In February, it just reiterated the provisional measures in January. But in January, March, May, they indicated significant provisional measures. For example, in May, they said to Israel, you cannot launch the offensive in Gaza. On Rafah. Right? Nothing happened. Israel just went its merry way. So we already know what's going to come. Even if the court finds Israel guilty of the crime of crimes, as it's called, genocide, even if Israel is found guilty, so long as the US blocks any action, nothing will come of it. But as I said, there are two ways to look at it. If you're looking for justice to be done, you're wasting your time. But if you believe that convicting Israel of the crime of genocide is a powerful weapon in the battle for public opinion, then I do think it's important to invest in that. And it's a good thing that the ICC issued the arrest warrants. You know, it's a good thing, for sure. But don't look for justice to be done. The justice has to be done by us. The courts could provide weapons in the struggle, but the struggle is ours, because nothing will come from the courts.
I really fear that, similar things to what happened in Syria will happen in the West Bank, namely temporary ceasefire. We've been hearing that there's prospect ceasefire in Gaza. I fear that a temporary ceasefire in Gaza with Hamas will lead up into a full annexation or invasion in the West Bank, destruction of resistance under the supervision of the PA. The head of the Shin Bet, the IDF intel has just said that he met with King Abdullah, just talking about the Syrian situation and how it might leak into Jordan and so on. Could that, are you worried that something similar would happen in the West Bank? Things are really intensifying in the West Bank at the moment. If there's a truce deal happened with Hamas in Gaza, Hamas is gonna bound by it, can't do anything about it in the West Bank, and they just exploit that the way they did in Syria with Hezbollah.
One thing you can say about Prime Minister Netanyahu, he knows how to extract the maximum, politically the maximum from a given moment. When he sees there's an opportunity, he goes for the maximum. And now there's an opportunity. There is the combination of the distraction of Syria and the overall destruction of what was called the axis of resistance. And between those two opportunities, and Netanyahu never passes up an opportunity, it's their view, it's a possibility to make a clean slate of the whole struggle. Gaza is gone. West Bank might be emptied out. And maybe Iran.
Next in line is Iran, probably through Iraq. Yeah, things are getting a bit more and more complicated by the day. I mean, we thought the genocide is the ultimatum, but
the dominoes are dropping.
I mean, the genocide is now fading into the background, unfortunately, with what's happening.
That's correct. That's correct.
But I echo what you just said. It's up to us. We need to keep fighting using those weapons provided us, legal weapons.
There's only one thing we can say with certainty. If we do nothing, things will get worse. They're not going to be stable. It's not like if you do nothing, it'll be stagnant. It's not as if you do nothing, it'll be status quo. If you do nothing, you can say with certainty, things will get worse.
I won't take more than that of your time. Thank you so much for the great conversation.